The blizzard had not been forecast. But then again, forecasts were a Citiman's thing, inked in newspapers that never made it this far west. Out here, the wind made its own decisions. It came down from the high ridges that flanked the valley like weary shoulders, carrying snow thick as sackcloth and cold as judgment. By nightfall, the trail leading to the cabin was already gone, swallowed beneath a shifting sea of white. Joda Clay pressed her back against the log wall of the cabin, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The fire was low, the woodpile nearly gone, and the pain in her belly had grown into something she could no longer reason with. It clawed through her like a river carving stone. She was alone, save for the flickering shadows and the ache of coming birth. Her husband had been dead 6 months now. A bear, they said, though she never found the body, only his horse come back spooked and riderless. Since then it had just been her and the baby inside her, growing like a secret beneath her heart. The nearest neighbor, the Dubecks, lived 12 miles west, past the frozen creek, and through stands of pine that creaked and moaned in the wind. She thought about trying to reach them when the first pangs began, but the storm had come sudden and fast, and now even stepping off the porch would be a death sentence. She had no choice but to lie down on the pallet of blankets and wait for the pain to crest, wait for the child to come, wait maybe for the end. But then a knock came, not hard or hurried, just 3 measured raps that cut through the wind's howl like a voice across a chasm. She did not move at first, too stunned to believe it. Then another knock, slower this time, almost reluctant. She pushed herself up with effort, heart pounding not from fear, but from disbelief. Her legs trembled as she made her way to the door, her hand shaking as she lifted the latch. He stood there like something the storm had carved from its own ribs, a tall figure, wrapped in a wool coat dusted white, snow clinging to his beard and lashes. His eyes were the only warm thing about him, the color of creekstone and full of something quiet and solemn. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough with cold, "you're in trouble." She opened her mouth, but nothing came. Only her hand moved, reaching out, not to beckon, not to push away, but as if to tether herself to something solid. He stepped inside without waiting, kicking snow from his boots. The storm followed, swirling in after him until she forced the door shut behind. "I heard you," he said simply. "Not with my ears, maybe, just knew to come." There was no time to question it. The next pain seized her with such force she crumpled to the floor, a low cry breaking from her lips. He caught her, cradled her weight with arms that felt impossibly steady. She smelled wood smoke and wool and something faintly like juniper. He didn't speak again, just carried her to the bed and laid her down gentle as river silt. The hours that followed were thick with pain and silence, broken only by the woman's cries and the soft, commanding murmur of the stranger's voice as he coached her through. He moved with the surety of someone who'd done this before. When she bled, he pressed rags with a firm hand. When the fire waned, he fed it with what little remained of the split logs. When her strength flagged, he lifted her head to help her drink. And then, as dawn edged pale and trembling against the frost-laced window, the child came. A girl, small, wrinkled, furious with life. Joda wept then, the sobs racking her with more violence than the labor had. The stranger wrapped the infant in his coat and handed her over without a word, something unreadable in his face. "You saved us," she whispered. He shook his head. "Only helped you do what you were already strong enough to do." She blinked back tears, trying to study him, memorize the shape of him against the fading dark. "What's your name?" But he only smiled faintly, stood, and walked to the door. Snow had stopped falling. The wind had gentled into something like breath. She meant to stop him, meant to rise and say something, anything, but her body would no longer obey. By the time she gathered the will to lift herself and push the door open, he was gone. There were no footprints in the snow, only silence and the newborn's steady breath warming against her neck. She named the baby Spring. The days that followed were spent in a hush so profound it felt sacred. Joda moved slow, each motion a negotiation with her healing body. She kept the fire going with what branches she could reach from beneath the eaves, melting snow for water, rationing the last of the salted venison. The baby, Spring, nursed with a fierce will, her tiny fists curling like seeds in the palm of Joda's hand. Though the stranger had vanished without trace, he remained thick in the air somehow, like wood smoke that lingers in hair and blankets long after the fire dies. She found herself listening at night for the cadence of his breath, the scrape of his boots. It shamed her, how much she wished for a sound that did not come. By the second week, the sun began to push through the trees again. The world outside glittered with thaw. Icicles dripped slow tears from the eaves. A chickadee landed on the windowsill one morning, black eyes sharp and quick, as if to remind her that life had a rhythm and it was not hers alone. She stitched by firelight when the baby slept, using scrap linen to make swaddles, working the needle with the same grit she'd once used to hitch a team to plow. Her hands ached from cold, but they kept busy. A woman's grief had to move somewhere, and hers moved through the thread. When the trail thawed enough for passage, she bundled Spring against her chest and made for the Dubecks. 12 miles by sled, pulled by the old mule who had more loyalty than sense. It took nearly a day, and the light was waning when she arrived, her face raw from wind, her arms stiff from cradling the child so long. They took her in without question. Manya Dubeck fed her warm milk and boiled potatoes and wrapped her feet in sheep's wool. Her husband, Thomas, stared at the baby like she was a visitor from heaven. "You say a man came in the storm?" Manya asked that night, stirring ash in the stove. Joda nodded, tall, quiet, had a scar on his brow like something caught him sideways. Thomas frowned. "Ain't no one lives close enough to make that walk in that kind of weather. No one I know would risk it." "I didn't imagine him." "I don't think you did," Manya said gently, "but it's strange." Strange became the word they used when there was no other. The stranger became a kind of myth among the settlers that spring, folk who lived 10, 12 miles apart and still managed to pass stories like bread between them. Some said he was a trapper gone half wild, others a preacher in penance. One old man insisted he was the ghost of a soldier who died in the mountains the winter the war ended. Joda said nothing, not to argue, not to correct. She just went home and planted her garden late, with Spring bundled on her back and hope trembling in her fingers like the seeds she buried. The summer came long and dry. The creek ran low, and the air buzzed with flies. Spring grew into herself with a kind of stubborn grace, her gaze solemn and wide. She slept nestled against Joda's side, breath deep and even, her little hands often resting on her mother's chest as if to make sure she was still there. And sometimes, when the night turned soft and the wind came down from the ridge in its quieter voice, Joda would step out onto the porch and scan the trees. The fireflies stitched gold into the dusk, and the moon watched like an old friend, but the path remained empty. Until the first storm of the next spring. Not snow this time, but rain, thick, cleansing, relentless. It fell for 3 days, soaking the ground until it steamed, and on the morning of the 4th she saw the prints. Boot tracks, deep, fresh, pressed into the soft earth outside the cabin door. She did not call out. Joda stood in the doorway, the baby held against her hip, rain drumming low on the porch roof, and stared down at the tracks. They pointed inward, toward the cabin, then away again into the pines. As if he'd come close, maybe stood for a long while, and then turned back before courage, or something softer, bade him knock. Spring stirred against her, letting out a sleepy mule. Joda shifted her, kissed her crown, and stepped barefoot onto the wet earth. The mud clung to her soles, cold and rich with the scent of thawing roots. She followed the prince without thinking, pulled forward not by fear or hope exactly, but by something weightier, like memory made flesh. They led past the garden, where sprouts had begun to push through, and into the trees, where fog hung like breath. Every so often she paused, listening. The woods were never still, not really. But there was a hush in the way the leaves moved, as if they too were waiting. She found him not far from the creek, standing beside a fallen cottonwood with his back to her. His coat was the same, though more worn now, and the hat in his hand was damp with rain. He did not turn as she approached. He seemed to sense her presence, the way an animal senses weather. "I thought you might come," he said at last. "You were here before," she replied. "I was. Why didn't you knock?" He turned then, slow, careful. His eyes found hers, and though they held the same quiet as before, something in them had changed. Grief lived there now, but also a kind of light, like the sun behind storm clouds. "I wasn't sure I had the right," he said. "What I did before, it wasn't about staying. You helped bring her into the world. And I've thought of her every day since." She searched his face. The scar she remembered ran across his brow like a faded question. His beard had gone more silver at the edges, but he was the same man, the one who had appeared in a storm, held her through the worst of it, and vanished like a dream before morning. "She's called Spring," Joda said. A small smile ghosted across his face. "It suits her." "Why did you come back?" He looked away, out toward the water, because the thaw always brings back what winter tried to bury. There was silence then, not the kind that demanded words, but the kind that held room for breath, for the closeness of two people not yet sure of each other, but no longer strangers. He stepped forward slowly. "My name is Ilias." She nodded, filing it away like something fragile. "Do you have somewhere to be, Ilias?" He looked at her then, long and searching, as if weighing the cost of honesty. "No, I lost what little I had. A cabin burned last fall, a brother long before that. And after that, I drifted, took odd work, kept moving." Joda shifted the baby, who blinked up at Ilias with unblinking eyes. "Then maybe you could stay, for supper at least. I could use a warm fire." She turned then, walking slowly back through the trees, trusting he would follow. Behind her she heard his steps, not loud, not hurried, just steady. Inside the cabin, the fire was already lit. She laid Spring in the cradle and stirred the stew pot that hung above the coals. The smell of wild onion and root vegetables filled the space. Elias stood near the door for a moment, unsure, until she nodded him in. He removed his coat, setting it on the peg by the hearth, and sat. They didn't speak much while they ate, but Joda watched the way he glanced toward the cradle, as if anchoring himself with the child's small, rhythmic breath. When the meal was done, he helped her clear the bowls, drying them with a care that felt foreign and familiar all at once. That night, as the storm eased to a whisper and Spring slept without stirring, Joda sat across from Elias in the low firelight and said, "You don't have to vanish again." He met her gaze, something reverent in the way he looked at her. "I'd like to see who she becomes." "Then stay a while," she said. "See it with me." He stayed. Not with ceremony or pledge, but in the quiet way moss clings to stone, slow, patient, unnoticed at first. Joda didn't ask for more than he gave, and Elias never tried to explain what couldn't be. He slept in the lean-to, rising early to split wood, mend the chicken coop, haul water from the creek before the sun could silver its surface. He moved like a man who knew how to fit into silence. Spring grew with the weeks, her fists uncurled. Her legs kicked against the air like she meant to run before she could crawl. Elias took to carrying her sometimes, a bundle against his chest while he worked. She watched him with the steady curiosity of a soul newly arrived, and he treated her like someone with history, not fragility. Joda watched too, not always directly, but from doorways, from garden rows. She watched the way he reached to steady Spring's head, how he softened his voice near her, how he sometimes stopped mid-task just to let her tiny hand grip his finger. He never asked questions about the past. She never offered more than he seemed ready to hold. But in the gaps between work and sleep, between planting and harvest, something unspoken wove itself between them. In late June, a wolf came down from the ridge, lean with hunger. It circled the chicken run and left prints around the smokehouse. Elias tracked it without asking, gone before dawn with his rifle slung low. He returned at dusk with blood on his sleeve and a fresh scar on his arm. Joda cleaned the wound by lamplight, hands steady, jaw tight. "You could have been killed." He didn't flinch as she stitched. "Could've. You think that's something to shrug at?" He looked at her then, sharp with heat. "I think I've already died more than once, Joe. This is the closest I've come to living in a long time." The name Joe caught her off guard. No one had called her that since before the loss. She looked at him, thread trembling between her fingers, and something in her chest shifted, tender and terrible. After that, she began to speak. Not all at once, not in monologue, but in pieces, the way you might offer dried apples from a jar, one at a time, enough to nourish but not overwhelm. She told him about her husband, Nathan, about the way he sang to the baby she carried, about the smell of sawdust on his skin. She spoke of the night he didn't come home, the search party, the silence that followed. Elias listened the way some pray, with his whole body. He didn't interrupt, didn't reach to comfort, he just stayed. And in turn, he spoke too. About a younger brother, Simon, who died beneath falling rock in a mine near Silverton. About how Elias had carried the guilt like a second spine. How he'd wandered for months, years, never landing anywhere long enough to grow roots. "Why'd you come that night?" she asked him once, when summer was thick in the air and the garden heavy with green. He thought a long time before answering. "There was a hawk," he said at last, "circling low. I followed it without knowing why. Then the wind shifted, heard the pain in it, like something crying through the trees. I couldn't keep walking." She took his hand then, not with desperation, not even invitation, just recognition. They began to eat dinners together, not just share them. He carved a chair for her out of oak. She mended the frayed seams of his shirt. These things felt small, but they were not. They were choices, made daily, quietly, with reverence. And one night, after Spring had drifted to sleep with her cheek against Joda's breast, Elias knelt beside the hearth and said, "I think I'd like to stay until the frost comes." Joda, her voice low, answered, "Then I'll make sure the fire never dies." By the time the leaves began their slow turning, the cabin no longer felt like a place for survival. It felt like a home. Not the kind built by blueprints or bought with coin, but the kind forged in the rhythm of shared mornings and unspoken trust. Elias built a cradle from cedar wood, not because Spring needed a new one. She had grown beyond swaddling and into wobbly knees and laughter, but because he wanted to make something lasting, something with his hands that could bear the weight of beginnings. Joda watched him work beneath the elm out front, his knife moving sure and slow. Sawdust caught in his beard, clung to the folds of his shirt. He was not beautiful in the way of polished men, but in the way of mountains, weathered, unmoving, honest. That fall the valley flooded. A week of relentless rain swelled the creek until it leapt its banks and rolled through the low fields like a beast. Joda had planted late beans there, and she knew by the second day they were lost. She didn't weep. She'd lost too much already in her life to cry over beans. But she stood in the doorway with Spring on her hip and a weight behind her ribs that felt too familiar. Elias came up behind her. He didn't speak, didn't offer the soft lies that folks sometimes did, about next season, about what could be salvaged. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her back, between her shoulder blades, grounding her. They stood like that a long while. Later he brought in stones from the creek to build a new path, said the ground needed rising, said if the water meant to take, they'd just build higher next time. She didn't tell him, but she loved him for that, for the way he didn't try to stop the world from breaking, only to meet it head-on with hands calloused from repair. That winter came early. Frost rimed the window panes before the leaves had fully dropped. They filled the smokehouse with venison and wild herbs. Joda dried apples until her fingers cracked from peeling. Elias trapped rabbits, skinned them in the yard while Spring toddled nearby, fascinated and unafraid. At night, after Spring was asleep, Jota and Elias would sit near the hearth. He'd read from a tattered book he kept in his saddlebag, a collection of poems worn soft from years of thumbing. His voice was gravel-smoothed, steady, and she found that even the words she didn't understand felt safe when spoken by him. "You ever think about leaving again?" she asked him one night, the wind hissing through the eaves. Elias looked into the fire. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere. And now—" He turned toward her then, his eyes lit by flame. "Now I think I was just waiting to be found." She reached across the space between them. He took her hand. They didn't kiss, not yet. That kind of love, the real kind, needed more than warmth and proximity. It needed to be built, the same way he'd built the cradle, with patience and care and the willingness to begin again even after splinters. But they sat that way for a long time, hand in hand, the fire humming, the baby breathing soft in the next room. And outside, the snow began to fall. Spring came late that year. The snow lingered, clinging to the hillsides like old sorrow. But when it did retreat, it did so all at once, like a hand unclenching. The earth turned to mud, then to bloom. Buds opened on the willow. Birds returned in cautious pairs. Even the air felt changed, tasting of thawed stone and sap. Joda knelt in the garden, coaxing new shoots from the ground, her skirt damp at the knees. Spring toddled through the rows, speaking in a language all her own, a lilt of vowels and chirps that only Elias seemed to understand. He called her little sparrow now. She'd taken to riding his shoulders as he walked the fence line, her hands tangled in his hair, her laughter high and bright. The three of them moved like a constellation, separate, yet always turning toward one another. One morning, Elias didn't rise before the sun. Joda found him sitting at the edge of the porch, staring toward the ridge. His hands rested on his knees, empty of tools. "You dreaming with your eyes open again?" she asked softly. He didn't smile, not right away, just looked up at her with something caught in his throat. "I had word," he said, "from a man passed through about my brother." She sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, waited. "Turns out Simon left a child behind, a girl, lives east near Leadville. She's nearly grown now." Joda said nothing at first. The wind stirred her hair across her cheek. "You want to go to her," she said at last. "I think I need to." A bird landed on the porch rail then, blue-throated and trembling from flight. They watched it together. "When?" she asked. "Soon as the pass is clear." She nodded, and after that. Elias was quiet a long time. "Depends if I'm still wanted here." Joda looked at him, really looked. "You were never just wanted, Elias, you were needed." He reached for her hand. "I'll come back if you'll have me." She squeezed his fingers. "If you don't, I'll come find you myself." He left 2 weeks later, with a pack slung over his shoulder and Spring asleep against Joda's chest. He kissed the baby's forehead, then lingered, forehead resting against Joda's, the breath between them shared and full of every word they hadn't said aloud. "I'll be back before first frost," he whispered. The summer passed in green and sweat and growing things. Joda worked the fields with a strength born of rhythm. Spring learned to speak. Her first real word, clear and sure, was Papa. It hollowed Joda out and filled her again all at once. Letters came, 2 in total, written in a careful, slanting hand. Elias told of the girl, Myra her name was, said she had her father's eyes but her mother's fire. He was staying nearby, helping where he could, giving her time to know him, time to trust. The third letter didn't come, nor the fourth. Joda waited, through the late heat, through the first whisper of chill. She watched the ridge for any sign. And then, just as the first frost crisped the morning air, she saw a shape moving through the trees. He was thinner, dust on his boots, but the moment she saw him, something settled in her chest that had been trembling for weeks. Spring shrieked, toddling toward him like the ground itself pulled her forward. Elias dropped to one knee, arms wide, and caught her up like she was air and light, and everything worth returning to. Joda walked to them slowly, quietly. When she reached them, Elias stood and faced her. There was nothing grand in what followed, no declarations, no rush. He just took her hand. This time, she didn't let go. That night, as the fire burned low and Spring lay curled between them, Joda leaned her head against Elias' shoulder. "You kept your word." "I meant to," he said. And outside, frost painted the windows in delicate lace. Inside, warmth gathered in every corner, not from the hearth, from presence, from return, from the knowledge that sometimes, even when the trail vanishes and silence falls, the heart still finds its way home.